Good afternoon. Welcome. It's so lovely to see everyone who is here today. We look like we will have pretty much a full house, which is absolutely fantastic. I am the Reverend Dr. Jason Cook. I am the minister here at Tapestry Unitarian Universalist Congregation, which is where you are at this moment. And we are so delighted to be able to host this event that is put on by the Brown Club of Orange County. This is I don't know if any of you have noticed, but we're living in a very interesting historical time. Have you had any inkling of that along the way? This is a congregation that is dedicated to figuring out how to better our world, especially when our world is complicated like it is right now. And so the theme of today's lecture really hits home for us and intersects with our values, who we are. We're a congregation of people with a variety of religious beliefs. We have atheists and agnostics and people who believe in God. But more importantly, we come together around the values of justice and equity and building a better world together. And all of these things are things that we'll be talking about today, hearing about today, and I'm really excited about that because it is a complicated time. And I think all of us are trying to make meaning of it, and what we will hear today will help us to do that. And without further ado, I am going to introduce the next person who will be speaking. This is Scott Westerfield. Scott is a member of Tapestry. He is also the founder of the Brown Club of Orange County and was its president for a long time. He's worked out, yes, absolutely, deserves applause for that. He's worked out in the community for LGBTQ justice and a variety of other things over the years. He is truly, truly dedicated to serving the community, and that has shown in his actions. He has a degree, I won't say the year, Scott, because there's no reason to do that, from Brown, an AB in international relations, right? So he has a perspective that is very welcome at a moment like this. And if you are here today as you are, you're probably here because of one or maybe both of two reasons. One, you are concerned about democracy and you want to hear about how people throughout history have responded in times when democracy is threatened. And two, Scott can be very persuasive. Either way, you are in for a very meaningful time. So without further ado, I introduce Scott Westerfield.
Thank you, Jason. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Great. I'll start with the question of the day, which is why am I wearing this? And that's because I brought the wrong brand of generic cat food home and my cat didn't like it. So. No, it's a skiing, first world problem, a ski trip. And now I have bionic pins in my elbow, so thank you for those who are asking. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thanks for coming out on this beautiful Saturday to share a conversation with Brown Club Orange County and today's guest, Professor Corey Brettschneider, author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank Reverend Jason for his introduction and for welcoming us here, and the board of Tapestry for making it possible for Brown Club to hold the event here. I'd also like to thank these particular people, Kathy Spahn and Cheryl Hagan, for preparing the yummy food we have here. Is Kathy around? Our AV team volunteers, Grayson Gothard and John Miller over there. And before I forget, this is being recorded, so please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so yet. I'd like to thank our Brown Club Orange County co-presidents, Arisha Ashraf and John Choi. Could you raise your hands, please? In the back there. There's John. There's Arisha all the way at the back. My fellow Brown Club board volunteers, please raise your hands. There's a bunch of you here. Don't be shy. Thank you. And my husband and today's bartender, Ed Miskovich, off in the corner there. who has helped me in countless ways, not only today, but through the years in activism. I want to also give a special shout out to the 11 Stanford alumni and guests here. Could you please raise your hands? Good show. Thank you, Robert. Thank you. We also have in our audience a number of generous angel donors whose contributions have greatly helped to fund our event. Please stand when I call your names. Cameron and David Barrett. Liz Baer and Jeff Gothard. I saw you up there somewhere. There you go. Please stand up. No, stand. Stay. Connie Hughes. Judy Kaufman. Where are you, Judy? Ah, there you are, behind the pillar there. Nung Soo Kim, who could not attend today. David and Penny Kinnear, I see you right back there. Come on. Roz Laudati and Jim Pick. Where are you, Roz? I saw you here. Thank you. Gina Martinez. Is Gina here? Nope, couldn't make it. Philip Reams. And Ed Miskovich. Thank you. Last but not least, I was going to say 48, but are 51 actually of my fellow Tapestry members who've supported this endeavor financially, by spreading the word, and by showing up. I want to give a special shout out to two people who are not here today, Rona Henry and Sue Deering, for donating money for complimentary scholarship tickets, which a half a dozen of you have taken advantage of. My fellow alumni and I are very deeply grateful for your support. Okay, so why this event? Planning for this event began in April of 2025, I think, Corey, when our club first reached out to Professor Brettschneider regarding the possibility of a visit to Orange County. We had heard that he was a political scientist and historian who specialized in the Constitution, the separation of powers, and the role of the presidency. But our discussions were well underway before we realized just how important and pertinent his book is to this moment in American history. A relevance that has only increased, unfortunately, as each element of the MAGA Project 2025 agenda has been implemented. Corey is a busy guy, appearing on podcasts, national radio, and television programs like the PBS NewsHour. Some of you may have seen that clip, when he's not writing or teaching at Brown. So we are very grateful that he has flown out from Providence, Rhode Island, just to be with us here today. Hold your horses here. As you may have noticed, we have hardcover and paperback copies of the book available for sale at a significant discount after the presentation. The sale of these books is helping to underwrite the travel costs, venue rental, and catering for this event. If you want to delve deeper into the topic of today's presentation, I hope before you leave, you'll consider picking up a copy, which Corey will be happy to autograph for you. And with that, I want to, not yet, I want to give a little CV here. Corey's CV is about 14 pages long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will share a few highlights. He earned his bachelor's degree in politics and philosophy at Pomona College, Southern California, a Master of Philosophy and Political Thought from Cambridge, a master's and a PhD in political philosophy from Princeton, and his JD from Stanford Law, which helps explain. Professor Brettschneider taught in various capacities at Harvard, at Princeton, and at Fordham Law School before coming to Brown 24 years ago, right? 2002, 24 years ago. How's that working out for you, by the way? Is that good? Good. Corey has published 21 academic articles. His writings have appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, Politico, and The Washington Post. He has authored 7 books, including The Oath and the Office, published in 2018, and I believe you said you have a podcast focused on that, same name. So be looking for that, folks. And of course, his most recent book and the subject of today's presentation, which earned the prestigious American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award just last year in 2025. So, in case you're wondering, like I was, what the heck is the Silver Gavel Award? Listen up. Since 1958, the award has recognized outstanding work that fosters the American public's understanding of law and the legal system. In 2025, there were 122 nominations, 24 finalists, 8 awardees, and of all of those, and across all of media, there was one book that won, The Presidents and the People. We are indeed honored to have the author with us today. Please join me in welcoming back to Southern California, Professor Corey Brettschneider.
It's a pleasure to be here. I heard the chirp in the audience, which is a reference to Pomona College. If you don't know this, Pomona is not far from here. The mascot of Pomona is the sage hen, which is a bird that cannot fly. And so whenever Pomona people see each other, they give this terrific greeting of chirp, chirp in reference to the bird that can't fly. And so great to hear that. Great to be welcomed back to California, to Southern California. What we're going to talk about today, is a serious topic. We're going to talk about threats to democracy. Can you hear me okay, too? Volume's good. We're going to talk about... Let's just settle here. We're going to talk about threats to democracy, not just in the present, of course, and this podcast that I'm doing every week, the Oath in the Office podcast, which you can follow, is really about what's happening week to week, and we really are seeing a weekly threat to democracy. I'm proud that we've had leaders in the fight against democracy every week, including Stacey Abrams and Southern California's own Ted Lieu, talking not just about the threat, but also talking about the future and how we recover. And as you'll hear from me today, part of what I'm going to talk about is the current threat, but mostly past threats to democracy. And to be honest about what we're facing, I'm not going to sugarcoat how dangerous this is. I'm also going to point to parallels from the past. But the takeaway, I think, and hope will be that we've survived before and we'll survive this as well. And so as much as it's a talk about the seriousness of what we're facing at the moment, it's also a talk about hope. And a talk in particular about that hope coming not from the traditional checks on power, the Supreme Court, the Congress, but on citizen checks, on we the people, and on democracy, really saving democracy. And so that's why, as much as we're talking week to week on this podcast, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure, in the Q&A, about threats to democracy and how serious they are, the takeaway of this talk is not bleak. It's going to be energy, and it's going to be hopeful, and it's going to be about really why all of us have before saved democracy and can again. Let's start actually with the current threat to democracy. And one of the strange things about the book, eerie things, was that within a day of it being released, the Supreme Court decided its immunity case. Trump versus the United States. And I'll just, for those of you who don't know it exactly, I'll lay out what happened in Trump versus the United States. For the first time in American history, and based on no case law, and I could double down on talk about why this really was a lawless decision, the Supreme Court of the United States said that not only a sitting president has immunity when it comes to official duties, but that a former president has immunity. And essentially what that case did was stop dead in its tracks the three ongoing, there was one case in which Trump was convicted, but there were 3 ongoing cases in which Trump was not just accused of crimes, but indicted. One to do with January 6th, one to do with stolen documents, actually related to a law that was passed in the aftermath of Nixon's own battle with the National Archives about documents. He was charged under the Espionage Act there, and one, the Georgia case, about also related to January 6th. The Supreme Court essentially wiped all of that away. And it came as a shock to many people because we're used to thinking about the Supreme Court, of course, as a check on abuse of power. And the framers certainly thought about it. But what I argue in the book, and this is why its relevance is so close to the publication date, it was almost uncanny that it was released that day, is about why these traditional checks on power, as important as they are, really have not worked in the past when we've faced threats akin to the threat that we're facing right now. And in fact, what I argue and what I'm going to explain to you in the talk today is that when we've faced past threats to democracy, the Supreme Court has almost always made things worse, that they participated in that threat. And so as much as that's what's certainly going on in the immunity cases, they're making things way worse, you'll see that's happened before. What about Congress and what the framers thought of as the check of impeachment on a president? That has never worked. It not only didn't work in the 2 impeachments that we have faced in recent years with Trump, but it also didn't work in past impeachments. In all of these cases that I'm going to talk about, the 5 before Trump, none of them resulted in a full impeachment. The one challenge is the Nixon case, and I'm going to talk about the difficulty there, and I'm going to argue that the Supreme Court and Congress actually did not fully stop Nixon's abuses, and that we're still, in many ways, in the midst of them. So what did work? The traditional checks on power didn't work. What did work? Before I lay that out, that hopeful theme, I want to just show you that the question of the danger of the US presidency to American democracy was recognized from the very founding of the United States. As much as Hamilton and Madison and Jay talked about these checks on power that wound up not working, the Supreme Court, judicial review, the Congress, impeachment, there were other founders thinking about these problems who saw things quite differently. And probably the most important of those founders was Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry, of course, famous for the phrase, the slogan, give me liberty, or the question, give me liberty or give me death. The statement, give me liberty or give me death. Less understood was actually an opponent of ratification of the United States Constitution. Now, why did he oppose ratification? He thought that the document itself was so dangerous because it created an internal danger that could lead to the collapse of democracy of a republic. And that danger that he identified was the US presidency created in Article 2 of the Constitution. And his warning, don't sign this thing, don't ratify it, is based in that danger. So when I read to you what he says, you're going to find it a little frightening because it does speak to the threat that we're facing right now. He says the following: look, what's going to happen is everybody is assuming that George Washington is going to be the first president of the United States. He was the chaired the Constitutional Convention, the president of the Constitutional Convention, and it was widely understood he's going to be the first president of the United States. But what Henry said was, the system's not in danger with George Washington, but what if you get a bad president? And now here's the phrase that Henry used that really speaks to our moment. What if you get, hypothetically, a criminal president? And here's what he says, that what that person is going to do is they're going to start with small crimes, and they're going to realize how powerful they are, that there is no check on their own power. They're going to use tools that were thought to be benign, like the pardon power, to pardon co-conspirators. And those small crimes, rather than be stopped, are going to be encouraged. And as those small crimes are encouraged, they're going to get bolder and bolder with the criminality, this president, this bad criminal president, until, now here's the dramatic part of what he said. They're going to realize there is no check. He asked the question, what will stop this force of the presidency, this criminal presidency? His answer is nothing. And such a person is going to say the following. He imagines what this person will say to the American public once they've realized the degree of their power and how few the checks are. This person's going to say, away with your president, he declared, we shall have a king. That's Henry's prediction. Now, for a lot of American history, Henry was dismissed as paranoid. This is just a wild idea, you know, this won't happen, will never happen. Yeah, maybe we had Nixon, but that was an anomaly. But what I'm going to argue today is actually before Trump, in 5 instances, we've seen Henry's warning about the collapse of the republic at the hands of a president come to life. And in each of them, what happened was the traditional checks didn't work, just as he says. There was no Supreme Court that stopped it. It made it worse. There was no Congress that stopped it. But what did stop it, and what Henry didn't predict, because he predicted the collapse of the republic, was citizens fighting back, taking the Constitution that had become an authoritarian document in the hands of these presidents who threatened democracy, these 5, reinterpreting it as a democratic document, and then using their constituent power, forming what I call democratic constitutional constituencies, to prevail on recovery presidents to put back the democratic principles. And over we see that pattern. The checks don't work, but what does work is citizen power. Some of these citizens you'll have heard of, like Frederick Douglass, others like Sadie Alexander, and Thomas Cooper, I'm sure you haven't heard of, but you will by the end of today. And what I'm going to show you is not just that they took heroic stands against presidents that abused power, but that they won. And that's where the hope comes from, that they really outline a pattern and a strategy that's not guaranteed to work, but that has worked over and over, and that we can, in the present moment, use to recover our democracy. The instinct, of course, is to say that what we're facing right now is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like it. And each of these 5 instances before this one are unique, but they share this common theme. We have faced threats, not just little threats to the Constitution, but taking Henry at his word, to the entire republic before, and with the aid of these citizens, there's no Constitution police, not the courts, these citizens we've recovered. And that's why my argument's going to be that we are at a pivotal moment right now in which we can recover if we heed these lessons of the past. Let's start with George Washington, because we'll get some hope. The framers knew he was going to provide a way forward for the American presidency, a person of virtue, and he makes good on that promise in his second inaugural. I'm actually going to read to you from the second inaugural. You might think that's going to take a long time, but it's only 175 words. It's extremely fast, the shortest ever given. And what he says is this: he's just taken the oath of office, which is required by Article 2 of the Constitution. The only oath that's laid out word for word is in Article 2. The president has to pledge to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. It's not any kind of role. That's the job description. And as you heard my podcast every week, the oath in the office takes its inspiration from that. And here is what Washington says about the oath: that if it shall be found during my administration of the government that I have in any instances violated willingly or knowingly the injunctions thereof, I may, besides incurring constitutional punishment, be subject to the upbraidings of all who are now witness of the present solemn ceremony. Imagine this. What he's saying is, in the second inaugural, as I just took the oath, it defines the job: respect the law, in fact, protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution, the law. And if I violate it, I want the people of the United States, we the people, to say, you violated the Constitution, to criticize me, to upbraid me, is the word that he uses. And if I really violate it, if I threaten the Republic, use that constitutional punishment, use that impeachment. The problem was, as Henry predicted, not everybody was Washington. And watching on to this second inaugural was our second president, John Adams, somebody who is widely praised as a great scholar, which he was, one of the main scholars of the Constitution, major scholars of the Constitution, probably the most prominent, with Woodrow Wilson anyway, to hold the office of president. That is all true. He has a miniseries starring Paul Giamatti, very good. I recommend it. Some of you have seen it. But what's less understood is that with all this learning, what his view was that the President of the United States was akin to the British monarch. He admired Montesquieu and the theory of the separation of powers. In fact, he used the word republic in a very odd way. Usually it's meant to mean anti-monarchy. He used it to include monarchy as a republic. And in fact, what he thought was that the British monarch was too constrained in his power, that the Parliament had gone too far in its limits on what the monarch could do. And his argument was that we could correct that mistake by making the American president even more powerful than the British monarch. He wasn't opposed to democracy altogether. He thought it had a place, and a few feet from where he lived in Philadelphia, in the House of Representatives. That was the place for democracy, but it had to be checked by this strong monarch, which of course was the office that he held. Now that all sounds very abstract until you start to see what happens when Benjamin Franklin's grandson, a man named Benjamin Franklin Bache, the editor of the Philadelphia Aurora, the chief critics of Adams and his Federalist Party, had the audacity to criticize Adams' foreign policy and also to criticize Adams' son in alleged corruption, if that sounds familiar. Adams and his wife are furious. The party is furious. And Adams signs, after Congress passes, a law known as the Sedition Act. Now let me tell you what's in the Sedition Act, because it's often been understated. It gets a little role in the Paul Giamatti movie. To my mind, it should have all been about the Sedition Act. What it says in its text is that it's a crime to criticize the President of the United States. Now here's the catch. It's not a crime to criticize the Vice President of the United States. Now I knew this crowd would get why that's weird, and I'll just explain it a little bit. Under the rules of the time, the 1796 election is the last time this is in place, the second place vote getter, the chief rival of the president, the loser, becomes vice president. And the vice president was Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the opposition Democratic Republican Party to the opposing Adams Federalist Party. The law is gerrymandered. It is arranged so that it is an attempt to shut down Jefferson and his party. And Jefferson has to sit there worried about his own prosecution, actually, under the law, in silence as vice president of the United States and president of the Senate as the law is passed. He is actually thinking he might be charged under the law. And it isn't just some abstract threat. In addition to the charges against Bache, which are very early on, 1798, the year the law is passed, there used to be historians thought, by the way, and this is part of why I don't blame the miniseries or Paul Giamatti for understating it. It used to be thought there are 35 prosecutions. But actually we know now that the number is 135. It was a massive assault on the opposition party. It included a prosecution successfully and imprisonment of a sitting congressman from Vermont, Matthew Lyon, for criticizing Adams again on his foreign policy and his alleged allegiance with the British on the floor of the House of Representatives. And it also included the major opposition newspapers. And journalists at the time took sides. These were more like opinion journalists. But the 135 included an attempt to ensure that there would be no opposition party. And the newspaper editors that they targeted were not from both sides. They were from the opposing Democratic Republican Party. What about the Supreme Court, to go back to my theme in the immunity case? You would think that the First Amendment had been passed and ratified. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That what better example for the Supreme Court to step forward and say, we have a First Amendment in this country, we're different than British monarchy, and no, this law is unconstitutional. That's supposed to be the idea of how the court works, that it takes the Constitution, and when a law passed by Congress conflicts with it, it strikes it down, it condemns it. Not only did that not happen, But the most important lobbyist for the law, aside from Adams and his close associates, was Samuel Chase, the most prominent Supreme Court justice at the time. Not only is Chase a prominent advocate of the law, but Chase goes a step further. One of the most powerful newspaper editors opposed to Adams is a man named Thomas Cooper. And what Cooper is doing is telling in real time what I'm telling all of you. He's saying this law, this Sedition Act, is an example of monarchy. This president values monarchy. Now he's acting on it by suppressing the ability to even have a democracy. America will never be a democracy in the absence of George Washington if we keep going down this route. It's going to destroy it from the beginning, this idea of we the people, the idea of a republic. None of it's going to happen. So what Chase does, so incensed by Cooper's editorials criticizing monarchy, is he goes and sits on the trial of Thomas Cooper, becomes a Supreme Court justice, has the power to sit as a trial court judge, and time after time, he blocks any defense that Cooper is able to bring. So Cooper says, this is a violation of my First Amendment free speech rights. Just of course, that's what he says. It's the most obvious argument. Chase doesn't even allow the argument. Chase does thing after thing to ensure Cooper's conviction. And Cooper knows he's going to be convicted. So what is he going to do? Notice how dramatic this is, right? The Supreme Court is abandoned and is participating in the shutdown of the opposition party. It's led by a president of the United States. By the way, no way is Congress going to step in to impeach Adams. They're the ones that passed the law. They're controlled by Adams' party. They are staunch Federalists. So what's going to happen? Imagine how bleak it looked, right? If you feel like things are bleak right now. Cooper knew he was going to be convicted. He knew he wasn't going to get recourse from the Supreme Court. What was he going to do? He comes up with a brilliant strategy that you're going to see again and again throughout American history. Rather than try to speak to the jury, he speaks instead to the American people. He uses his own trial as a way of putting Adams on trial. After all, he's called Adams a monarchist, and here he is being prosecuted for calling the president a monarchist. What better example of Adams' monarchism than that? He makes maneuvers like trying to subpoena the president of the United States, and he's told you can't do that. And the most important thing that he does is each day he takes the transcript of the trial, which he's having recorded by an aide, and publishing it in newspapers throughout the United States. So the American people can see with their own eyes what's happening and why Adams really is guilty of this charge of monarchism. And that starts a movement. The movement is to use the election of 1800, which is coming up, as a referendum on the question of whether or not we want to have a democracy or not. And in that election, by the way, this is an important fact, Thomas Jefferson, presidents didn't campaign for themselves at that time. It was done through surrogates. In fact, Jefferson gave like one speech. It did not go well. And into the void steps Cooper and his allies, using this election essentially as a question. Do you want a democracy or not? And there was, now here's where it gets eerie, the similarities. One of the editors, also facing trials side by side with Cooper, uncovers a plot by Congress, which is they know they might lose the election. So he publishes this plot, which is that the Federalist Party has decided that they are going to create a committee when the election votes are certified in the Electoral College to deny votes cast against Adams. And they've calculated that if they can deny enough of these electoral votes, that the way the system is designed, and still works by the way, things will go to the House of Representatives where states will vote, each state gets its one vote, and the Federalists will win. It is the same plot that John Eastman, actually also a Southern California, used on January 6th. I don't know that Eastman knew about it, but it is the same plot. Duane publishes the information, and the Federalist Party is embarrassed. They back off the plan, actually, from the transparency. And he's prosecuted, but that plot is stymied. So into that void, without that plot working, it is going to be an election that's winnable, and it is won. Why? As this referendum on democracy. This party is an anti-democratic party, and if you vote against them, we can reclaim it. When Jefferson wins, he utters one of the most famous, but I think not fully understood lines in American history. He says in the first inaugural, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans." That isn't just a message of unity, it is a recognition that we will have no new Sedition Act. He makes sure it expires, never to return. Jefferson himself, we can talk about this, is famously hypocritical and deeply, deeply flawed. I never defend Jefferson as some sort of role model. In fact, he does secretly, at the same time that he proclaims wanting to have no Sedition Act, to have a right to free speech, he secretly, in letters to his allies, seeks the prosecution of his opponents. It's not a full recovery, but what is amazing is that when Madison takes office, the War of 1812 is in the midst, there are calls from the whole country, including from within now Madison's own party, now that they're in power, the Democratic Republicans, to have a new Sedition Act. And easily Madison could have gone along with this and said, okay, but this time it's different, it's war. He refuses. He says the whole reason why the Democratic Republican Party took power, really why it was formed, was in opposition to the Sedition Act. He invites his opponents, including a man named Hanson, to the White House. He embraces political opponents and ensures there's no Sedition Act. In fact, when one of his Army officers, a man who becomes President Jackson and is then military officer, tries in Louisiana to shut down free speech, he fires him. This norm of free speech isn't created when it's etched into the First Amendment. In fact, it's challenged. It's creating an opposition to a president who would shut it down. America is far from a democracy at this point, of course. And the second cluster of inspirational heroes, of these citizens who fought back, begins during the Buchanan administration. James Buchanan pretends that he is neutral on the question of slavery. He campaigns. He says this is going to be up to the Supreme Court to decide in its upcoming case that becomes known as Dred Scott. But it's not up to me. In real time, Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved person turned orator, turned writer, turned our most important constitutional thinker, I call him the true founder of American democracy in the book, calls this out. He says Buchanan's pretending to be neutral, and secretly he's lobbying the Supreme Court to protect slavery throughout the United States. And we now know through extensive archival research that he was absolutely right. In fact, Buchanan is writing letters to his allies on the Supreme Court and telling them to decide the case in the most radical way. And what Dred Scott says, once it's decided, is that black Americans have no rights under the Constitution. They are not even citizens of the United States. A radical, not just racist, but in my mind the most evil decision in American history. How are those abolitionists who are trying to bring about a true democracy in the United States to respond? The main view is not Douglass's, it's his former mentor, Lloyd Garrison, holds the view that the only way to have a democracy in the United States is to get rid of the Constitution as a whole. The document is a pact with the devil, an agreement made in hell. That's Garrison's way of putting it. Scrap it all. And in our own time, you hear similar language. It's understandable why he's saying that, but Frederick Douglass has a different way of seeing it. He says we need to learn to read the Constitution in the right way, and we've been reading it in the wrong way. The first way to do it is to start with its text. And what Dred Scott has done, and those who want to get rid of the Constitution because they think it's evil rather than slavery being evil, is they haven't learned to read it. Take the preamble, the most important 3 words in the Constitution. The framers considered language that would have actually begun, "We the white people." And Douglas says that was considered and rejected. Read it for yourself. What does it say? "We the people." A universal idea that rejects the idea of white supremacy. Look elsewhere in the Constitution. It talks about the ban on the corruption of blood. What does that mean? It meant that in England, in British monarchy, you could inherit the crimes of parents in the next generation. When the Constitution rejects that monarchical idea, it is rejecting slavery, he says, understood as a principle. Although it doesn't say that in its text, the principles of "We the People," of this ban on the corruption of blood, and I'm going to talk about 1/3 argument, he has more, are about equality under law. And the most important move that he makes, one that Lincoln will make famous forever in the Gettysburg Address, is the idea that you read the Declaration of Independence, which as he sees it, it's universal declaration of equality, as the lens from which to ensure the meaning and understand the meaning of every aspect of the American Constitution. Lincoln doesn't think that early in his presidency, and Douglas, it's not understood, I talk about this in the book, Douglas is a critic of Lincoln. But over time, through meetings in the White House, through extensive criticism by Douglas in the foreign press, Lincoln is very worried about the UK possibly intervening in the war on the side of the South, and Douglas criticizing him in the UK is a real threat, comes to change his mind. Douglas's main point is that this war must be about the morality of the Constitution. The morality of the war is the morality of equality, not just in opposition to slavery, but about 2 words, Douglas says, equal protection. And over time, Lincoln's views change. So when he talks in the Gettysburg Address, when he refers back to the founding of the country, he refers to the Declaration. He's acknowledging Douglas's idea. The same way that you saw Jefferson partially recover a democratic idea of the Constitution, you see it to some degree in Lincoln. In fact, he does endorse voting in the franchise for black soldiers. Douglas, by the way, in their meetings criticizes him, uses his example of his son to try to get empathy from Lincoln. He says, "My sons are not receiving the same pay as white soldiers, yet they're fighting for the Union." And he's using these arguments to bring Lincoln onto the side of democracy. When Lincoln dies, Douglas calls him a white man's president. He moved America forward, but not to the kind of equal protection that Douglas wanted to see. The difference, which you see, just as in the election of 1800, the election of 18 is a referendum on democracy. Douglas and his allies, through a series of black conventions, talking about these ideas, used the election of 1868 as a referendum on democracy. A white supremacist party, the Democratic Party, faced off against Ulysses Grant, who was backed by Douglas and promising this idea not just of equal protection under law, but of an equal right to vote in the 15th Amendment. And when Grant wins, he acknowledges his debt to Douglas and his democratic constitutional constituency devoted to an idea of equality, not just by endorsing the 15th Amendment, which is ratified, but most importantly, through a series of laws known as the Enforcement Acts, that, including the Ku Klux Klan Act is one of them, result in the prosecution of more than 1,000 white Klansmen at the hands of the new Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is formed to fight the Klan, to fight white supremacy, and to honor the people in 1868 who literally risked their lives, many of whom died doing so, in order to vote Grant into office. There is a real recovery of democracy, an ideal of equal protection written into the 14th Amendment. That's why those terms are so, the phrase is so familiar to you. It's etched into the meaning and text of the 14th Amendment. And realizing what Douglas says is the meaning of the American founding all along. Of course, and this is the third example I'll give you, that's not the end of the story. You see the cycle, crisis, and then crisis aided by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Dred Scott, of course, just as Samuel Chase threatened democracy, it's stoking the anti-democratic fervor of authoritarianism. I used to think that Woodrow Wilson was a hero, and many of us did. I was actually married in his house in Princeton, where I used to live. But what I did for the book was I went into the archives, not far from where I took classes actually at Princeton when I was a graduate student, and tried to understand what was Woodrow Wilson telling his students. And what Princeton did, and this is amazing that they did this, is there was an archivist who realized that this was an important moment in history, and he went and he collected from Wilson's students a series of notebooks. Many of them actually are leather bound. And no one had ever looked at them. But I found them in this box in Princeton and looked through them. And what they say goes so far beyond a lot of what's understood about Woodrow Wilson and his constitutional theory, his ideas of the American Constitution. He thought that the American president, first of all, was not equal to the other branches. He rejected that idea in Washington, that the president was a uniquely powerful and important person because he or she alone was elected by the entire American people. And Wilson thought the president had one obligation, an obligation he takes in part from Bismarck and the model of Germany, to pursue national efficiency. None of that sounds worrying yet, except when you understand that in these lectures he talks about one thing being in the way of national efficiency, and that's what he calls friction. And by friction he means integration. It is core to Wilson's ideology, his theory, that segregation is essential to efficiency, to national productivity, and that integration is its chief threat. So when he segregates the federal government, resegregates it after it was desegregated by Grant, when he resegregates the military after it was desegregated again by Grant, he isn't just, doing some not thought out thing. He's enacting his constitutional philosophy. He's called out in real time. It isn't that we just learned this for the first time, the things that I'm telling you, although nobody's looked in the books. In real time, unknown heroes, or somewhat well-known, but not known as he should be, William Monroe Trotter and a more well-known person, Ida B. Wells, call him out in real time. They go to the White House and they say, and we know this because Trotter leaked the transcript, they say, what you are doing is creating a national system of second-class citizenship. He's certainly not the first white supremacist president, but they are, in a sense, saying you are the first white nationalist president because you're not leaving racism as a local idea. You are spreading it with the power of the federal government, and as you grow the federal government, you are growing white supremacy. What does Wilson say back? He says you're creating friction and throws them both out of the office. There is an embedded idea in the early 20th century and in Wilson's ideology of white nationalism. When Trotter fights back, pushes in all sorts of ways, things are just getting worse. In fact, Wilson, during Red Summer, the most violent summer probably in American history aside from the Civil War, massacre of thousands and thousands of black Americans throughout the country. Wilson is giving speeches about so-called hyphenated Americans, or as he often said, hyphenates, meaning not white Americans, not white Americans with their history in 18th century Protestantism. He's challenging these so-called hyphenated Americans as the reason for these massacres. William Monroe Trotter, just to show you how bleak things work, is so upset by what things look like at the time, so distraught by it that he kills himself. That's how bad things work. And yet, what is amazing about this story is that over generations, the organizations, including the NAACP that Trotter and Wells helped to start, get so strong that by the time of Truman's presidency, they're ready. Walter White, the head of the NAACP, meets with Truman, who has been picked to replace FDR's Vice President Wallace because he's meant to assure white Southerners that he was fond of using the N-word, that he is on board with the idea of segregation, at least in the South. And yet, after the war, as black American soldiers are returning, he hears from Walter White about what's happening. And he's heard one story in particular about a soldier who was on a Greyhound bus headed home after fighting in World War II and beaten almost to death on this bus. What was his crime? He asked to use a restroom reserved for white people. And Truman, and this is one of the more remarkable parts of the story that I'm telling you, is so moved by the story that he asked Walter White what he should do. And Walter White is ready. He doesn't turn to the Supreme Court, which will never at this moment act, not to Congress, which will never act, but to citizens. He asked him to form a committee of citizens, not public officials, to study how to recover the amendments, the 13th Amendment banning slavery and the incidence of slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing those two words of equal protection, and the 15th Amendment banning discrimination against black Americans in the vote. How can we recover them? That's the charge to the committee. It could have turned out to be nothing, but I tell the story of Sadie Alexander, this unknown hero, how she uses the committee to outline a recovery of the Constitution. Based on the committee's recommendation, immediately he reverses the policy dated to Woodrow Wilson, segregating the federal government. Truman has an executive order integrating it, integrating the military, and he proposes, under her specific recommendation, what becomes the most effective tool in integrating American public schools. It's often thought to be Brown and the Brown versus Board of Ed, and that report does talk about the need to reverse Plessy versus Ferguson, the court's separate but equal doctrine. And Thurgood Marshall, who argues that case, is part of the people who testify in front of this committee. But the most important recommendation is to use financial incentives and disincentives to desegregate America's schools. Sadie Alexander is the first black woman to have a PhD in economics. She also is a lawyer. And she designs this technique that actually social scientists say was the most effective 20th century tool in desegregating America's public schools. The last of the stories that I'll tell, well, I say two, as you'll see in the book, a provision of law signed into law by Lyndon Johnson with the pressure of citizens. Movements that I know, just speaking to many of you were a part of, including the civil rights movement. The last story is hard to take. It's a challenge because it's a story of where we thought we recovered. We thought that we had these public officials who acted as heroes and that the checks and balances worked, including the Supreme Court in a case called U.S. versus Nixon 8-0, saying that Nixon had to respond to a criminal subpoena, we thought, because the president wasn't supposed to be above the law. But the way I tell the Nixon story is very, very different. The story I tell is one of a president who was pressured to step down, but whose pressure came from the totally unknown citizens of what's known as Grand Jury 1. These people, no one has ever spoken to, interviewed. I spoke to two of them. They're still alive, Ethel Peoples and Patricia Woodruff. They sat on a grand jury looking again and again, not just at the crimes of Watergate, not just at the cover-up, but at other crimes, including, as Daniel Ellsberg told me for the book, the attack on him on the Capitol steps, an attempt to incapacitate or beat him to death, a plot that actually was carried out, that he narrowly escaped. I tell that story in the book. Why don't you know any of those stories? Why don't you know the story, too, of Nixon's ordering on the tapes not just the firebombing of the Brookings Institution, but the theft of what he thought was evidence that he was engaged in treason in negotiations with the Viet Cong before he took presidency, to assure them that they would get a better deal if they delayed any peace negotiations with Johnson. None of that came out because the grand jury, although it voted in a straw poll, as Elaine Edlund, a legal secretary, put it, with two hands to indict the President of the United States, to indict Nixon, it never came to pass. Jaworski, who's supposedly the hero of this moment, the special prosecutor, told the grand jury, if you do this, if you indict a sitting president, Nixon is going to surround the White House with troops. He's going to engage in a coup, and you'll have triggered it. They said, we don't care, we're going to do it anyway. No person is above the law. That was their idea. So what happened? Jaworski makes a deal with the grand jury. He says, look, if you put off the indictment, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to court, and I'm going to get the remaining tapes. And I know a lot of this from his deputy, Philip Lacavara, who never wrote a book about Watergate, but gave me all this information, the book he would have written. He's the most senior member of the Jaworski team of the special counsel's office that's still alive. And they said, okay, well, Jaworski said, we'll get the remaining tapes in the Supreme Court. And most importantly, once the tapes are given over to Congress, and that's what we're going to do through a technique I'm going to call the roadmap, and once the president is forced to resign, then you can indict him. So you have the best of both worlds. We'll go to court, we'll get the tapes, we'll give them to Congress, the president will be publicly exposed, the truth will come out, he'll resign, and then we'll have the trial for all of these crimes. So what happened? A lot of it happened. U.S. versus Nixon is the tapes case where Jaworski, actually Philip Lacavara, who I interviewed, argued the case. 8-0, Nixon is not immune from a criminal subpoena. The tapes were handed over in this roadmap, as it became called, to Congress. And articles of impeachment were voted up in the House Judiciary Committee. And after those articles were voted, a delegation led by Barry Goldwater went to Nixon and said, you need to resign, and he did it. Vladimir Prigozhin, the foreperson of the grand jury, goes to Nixon and he says, okay, you promised. Now it's our time. We're going to indict the president. What happened after? It's part of what I'm working on now, but I can tell you what I know already. Jaworski met with Alexander Haig, and right after, the chief of staff, I should say, to President Ford after the resignation, and right after, almost immediately, the pardon happened. Not a pardon for something specific, but for all crimes committed during Nixon's presidency. We never learned about any of this because the pardon wiped it all away. And what Lacavara argued when he was vehemently trying to stop this pardon was if we allow this pardon, the president is going to retire somewhere in California, not far from here, and he'll become seen as an elder statesman, and we'll never know about the criminal presidency, how dangerous the presidency is. It was the warning that Patrick Henry gave us. And Lacavara's prediction was right. We never learned about the crimes of Watergate. There were attempts to recover. There are ways and techniques, that's what I'm talking about on the Oath in the Office podcast, to rein in a presidency, an independent counsel act, a congressional statute to ensure that, yes, the sitting president can be indicted. But all these ideas never took hold in the American public as they should have because the pardon hid so many of these crimes. And we are right now back to the same system that allowed for Nixon essentially to escape his crimes. A president who can't be indicted. Remember Nixon's famous line, of course, in the interview with David Frost, when a president does it, it's not illegal. Essentially what Trump has proven to be true for now. But now here's my point, and I'm eager for questions and comments, and we'll talk about the present in these past cases, but here's my point of the whole talk. Even though we haven't recovered from the Nixon presidency, we have recovered in the past, not from courts, not from Congress, but by citizens pushing back and taking the Constitution into their own hands. And although we have not recovered from the Nixon presidency, and certainly not from the Trump crisis that we are in the midst of right now, we can. And we can use heroes like Thomas Cooper, like Frederick Douglass, like Ida B. Wells and Sadie Alexander. We can use them as an inspiration for our own moment. And that's how we can push back and prevail and win. So thanks for listening. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Is this on? I think what we're going to do, can you hear me? What we're going to do is, because we're recording this, I'd like to ask anybody who's interested in asking a question to come up to the mic and state your question here. So come on up, we can form a line. I know there's got to be people out there with questions, but if not, I will prime the pump. Okay, come on up.
Thank you very much. It was fabulous and dense. So my question is about corporations. And, you say the president and the people, and then you have Citizens United. How do you see their power in this mix?
Yeah, well, I think that's a big part of what's happening in the current moment, is that the Supreme Court of the United States, I've really focused on the immunity case, but this is an equally important case, has made a series of maneuvers that really are threatening democracy. So it isn't just Trump. It is the fact that there's a court, some of whom have ambitions that I would say are on the authoritarian side that date back to the Reagan era. That's true of Roberts. Others, more recent appointees like Kavanaugh, who are themselves aiding in this threat to democracy. Now, one way that we're seeing it, of course, is in the immunity case and in the fact that the president escaped prosecution basically because the Supreme Court gave him a get-out-of-jail-free card. Famously, Trump said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, right, and get away with it. Well, what the court has essentially said is, just say it was your official duty, and then you could get away with it. Because the immunity is granted in cases of official duty, at least presumptive immunity. So they've really, now the other case is the one that you're talking about, a case that talks about the idea, uses actually this is not going to be welcome news, but I need to share it. The most important theorist of the First Amendment is a Brown professor. He's long dead, but you've heard his name, Alexander Michelson, outside Brown alum. He's not as well known as he should. And he is one of the only professors, I think, in history where the Supreme Court's like, we took our whole idea of the First Amendment from this guy. Now, when they did that, it was in a proud moment. It was a rebuke to the Red Scare. It was a recognition that the First Amendment didn't allow criticism of opinion. And what Michelson had said is, imagine we're all in this great town meeting. And if the moderator of the meeting starts to intervene based on the opinions of what people are saying, that's not democracy. So the Red Scare, the Smith Act, the shutdown of leftist speech, even if you don't agree with it, he wasn't a leftist, he didn't agree with that speech, is a shutdown of democracy. And the court embraced that. It uses a rule called viewpoint neutrality, saying basically all opinion is protected. Now, what the court did in Citizens United is it warped the idea that Michelson had that as important as who's speaking is the right to listen. And it said, why should it matter if it's a corporation or it's an individual? Who's speaking is just, less important than who's listening. So what that's resulted in is dominance. And of the conversation of the town meeting, it's as if, 8,000 corporations came in and bought the expensive seats and forced the rest of us off to the side. And there was no thought about the foundation of the view, which is supposed to be a healthy democracy. That's what Michelson was all about. So they've warped our idea of the First Amendment to use it as a way of defending the interests of the wealthiest in destroying, I would say, our elections. Now, what can we do to fight back? We've got to start to think about ways to organize. So one thing that I did at Brown was with a professor named Larry Lessig, who was my teacher actually at Stanford. We organized a group of local legislatures to pass a resolution demanding a new amendment to reverse Citizens United. Even short of that, ordinary legislation often can have an influence on the court. And so even if we can't get an amendment, when the Congress is restored to a Democratic party, we might have a chance of passing legislation that says basically corporations don't have an unlimited amount of money to spend in our elections. And will the court listen? Maybe, but if they don't, at least it's a fight. So, the theme works, not just in the examples that I gave, but in this one too.
Thank you so much for coming here and the work that you do.
Thank you.
I was a teenager during the Nixon administration, so I was paying attention by then. Ford's rationale, part of it at least, in pardoning Nixon was that he would no longer be able to exercise Fifth Amendment rights and everything could come out. That's the last I heard of it, but you perhaps know where the bodies are buried on that one. Thank you.
Well, what I'm doing now is picking up the story, partly on the Oath in the Office podcast, but also in a sequel to this book. And I'm going to talk about that. And I think Ford was, in many ways, well-intentioned. I think he thought that what was going to happen was, and this is part of what I say in the book, but also in this next book, was that there was going to be such a flood of criminal cases against Nixon that the country couldn't handle it. The country was facing massive inflation, much more than we're facing now. I think it was in the 30%. And he worried about the fact that the country would be derailed by these cases. And he thought, it's just better to push it all aside and move forward. And part of Ford's rationale, which was really well-intentioned and totally misguided, was that this was a one-time thing. We're not going to ever see a president like this again. And, the system worked, right, that he resigned. And he was wrong. So I think the pardon is among the biggest, well-intentioned, it might have been, mistakes in American history.
Building upon the pardon, do you think that it's a weakness of American democracy, given that, as you said earlier, completely derailed the Nixon investigation, and recently we saw the pardon of all the January 6th collaborators?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to answer that, but I first want to set it up. The framers, the anti-federalists who I mentioned, including Patrick Henry and his allies, said just that. They're like, the people like Hamilton and Madison, they're naive. They're calling this the benign power of prerogative. In other words, it's a remnant of a kingly power. It only can be used for good. And they're like, that's wrong. Because what you can do is you can pardon your allies. And if you're involved in crime, you're co-conspirators. So the anti-federalists lost that vote, right? The Constitution was ratified. But one thing that I've argued, and I do this in a piece in the Atlantic Monthly, is that there's a part of that power in the text that's not understood. And that's the phrase, except in cases of impeachment. The traditional view is it's basically meaningless. It just means that the president can't stop an impeachment from happening. But what I did with another scholar named Jeffrey Toulis, who actually has a master's degree from political science from Brown, he's one of the greatest living presidential scholars. We went back and we looked at the founding debates, at the initial, and it turns out that there were people who thought that what that meant was that the president's power is actually limited in instances in which the president was under suspicion. And what we're arguing is, although no court is going to say that legislation, again, I'm very focused on how can we save democracy? Legislation that limited the president's power to pardon co-conspirators, associates, family members, that is what we need. And that phrase, except in cases of impeachment, can be revived through legislation.
Thank you for your talk. I was surprised that there were 5 presidents, but I wonder if there were more, and how did you narrow it down?
I should say, there's definitely 6 in that. I'm not counting Trump in the 5. And what really characterizes Trump is that he's a combination of all these stories. The white supremacy, the assault on free speech. Think of the indictment of James Comey, unbelievable, and Letitia James, the attempted indictment. We are seeing each of these, the Supreme Court combining with the president to undermine legislation and the Constitution in the voting rights case and in the racial the anti-black gerrymandering that we're about to see. All of that is all of these cases. And so we are seeing each of the crises in real time with the Trump administration. So there's definitely 6. The criteria is Patrick Henry's. That's what I used for the book. He says, and just to go back, it's not just that a bad president might emerge. He's like, maybe the Constitution can handle that. It's that a president who actually threatens the republic can emerge. And so that's what defines these 6, I should say. Were there more? I don't know. I'm open to hearing about them. I've talked to people about that possibility, but I think I stick with the idea that these are the key 6 cases in which we've really seen a threat to the republic.
I grew up and was taught this myth about the Supreme Court, that it was actually a check on the presidency.
Right. We all were.
And yeah. And so can you talk a little bit about the history of the how the Supreme Court became so political, and has it always been this way? Has it exercised its authority to check the presidency in meaningful ways?
I would say that in almost, well, in all the examples certainly that I gave you, and I'll leave Nixon to the end because I think that's the most complicated one. It not only is not checking the presidency, they're complicit in what we were just talking about, the threat to the republic. So Samuel Chase, lobbying for the Sedition Act, sitting on the trials. Dred Scott is the Supreme Court, right? The most evil decision in American history at the behest of Buchanan, but they decided it. I didn't talk at all about the Andrew Johnson case, but he is one of the 5 before Trump. And that's another case where he's undermining Reconstruction with the aid of the Supreme Court. I mean, the Supreme Court really gutted the first Civil Rights Act, which required integration. It's sort of a history, part of the 1800s, 19th century history that we don't know. We think the 1964 Civil Rights Act was the moment in which public accommodations were forced to integrate. It happened in the 19th century first, through legislation, through the same Congress that passed the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, but in the civil rights cases, the Supreme Court struck it down. The Wilson period, you know, what he's doing actually in that dialogue with William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells is he's saying to them, he actually says a line to them in the transcript, which is, if you think that segregation is creating second-class citizenship for black Americans, that's your own insecurity. You are imposing that on my, you know, opposition to friction. And what he's doing in that heinous exchange is taking almost word from, he taught constitutional law, he knew what he was doing, taking word from word, Plessy versus Ferguson. So what about US versus Nixon? You know, that's the classic example of a case in which the Supreme Court was thought to really stop a president. And actually for a long time, you know, I've been teaching constitutional law for 24 years at Brown, I would have taught it that way. The president is not above the law. That's what the case is about. But when Brett Kavanaugh was nominated, I wrote a piece in Politico called, and this was before the credible, very real accusations by Blasey Ford about his sexual assault, saying this guy's got to be opposed because the piece was called Kavanaugh's Radical View of Executive Power. And I went and found all these examples where he had said, either US versus Nixon is wrong, we have to get rid of it, or more perniciously, and this really gives you an insight into where we are, I think that case is fine if we understand it as a case in which, and now listen to how I put this, in which the president was an unindicted criminal conspirator who was subpoenaed for information in a criminal case that he wasn't the target of. He narrows it so much. It's not about a president not being above the law. It's never going to happen. You know, it's like this weird, very narrow set of facts. And he's doing that on purpose. And so in the immunity case, Trump versus the United States, saying the president is above the law, essentially. What happens to US versus Nixon? Exactly what I warned about with Kavanaugh. They just took that way of narrowing the case. So, you know, there was a sense in which I could understand why everyone, including myself, thought that was an important moment. But it's very hard to see it that way. You know, it turns out Kavanaugh succeeded in turning that opinion into something very different. I mean, the other thing that I will say is, although that period is, you know, usually thought to be, this is how Ford would have put it. Jaworski, this great hero, came from Texas and, you know, saved us. No, that's not really what happened. What really happened was that elites conspired against a grand jury to ensure they couldn't do what they were promised they could do, which was to indict the president.
This is fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. I have been very encouraged by all of the increasing activism that we're seeing and the participation in No Kings, but it's very specific around Trump. And I'm just curious from your perspective if you have any advice for the commoners that are trying to go out and speak their piece, do things, and if there's any difference between the No Kings marches and the protests versus the business efforts that were made of the May Day protests.
I will say, there is nothing more important to my mind that's happening at this moment than No Kings. I mean, I imagine many of you are out there already, but this will work. I mean, this is, and I was saying this, you know, in the beginning when I was giving this talk of the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, everyone was saying, what's happening? Like, where is it going to? And I was urging there needs to be a movement, hoping a movement would. It's emerged. There are millions of people out there saying, think of how amazing the slogan is: no kings. We want democracy, not a wannabe monarch. It is a resistance to the court's immunity case, to Trump's corruption, to his theft, to his being above the law. And it is a demand for making good on what we thought U.S. versus Nixon was about, that no president is above the law. No one is above the law. That is why it's such a brilliant slogan. So you heard, we could send it out, but I worked with Judy Woodruff at PBS to try to talk about, to people directly about why your participation is so important, because it is what works. There's an amazing scholar named Erica Chernoweth whose empirical work shows, if you can get a sizable, not everyone, it's something like 4% of a nation's public out protesting against corruption, against an assault on democracy, against authority, it will work. Her work essentially predicts what happened in Hungary with Orban. And it will work here. But we've got to get out there, we've got to do it. So, it isn't a small part of the puzzle, it is the answer. It's not going to come from anything else. So, I applaud you. If you're out there, great. If you're not out there, join this amazing protest.
Thank you very much for a very informative conversation and for taking the time to come here. I'm only here to support you for the Stanford convention.
Yeah, I see you're free.
When you were talking about limiting the pardon power, particularly to relatives of relatives or co-conspirators, the immediate snarky question that came to my mind was where's Congress?
Yeah.
Doesn't that require Congress?
Yeah.
And so then the real question would be, how did that get, in the 5 examples or whatever you want to choose to tell us, how did that get resolved back then to be able to overcome these issues? That's never been, right?
Yeah. What I would say is, right, you need Congress to act, but Congress won't act on its own. It will act at the behest of a movement. And part of what I envision and am so hopeful about No Kings is that it will become a movement not just to get rid of Trump, but to ensure that No Kings is actually a principle embedded in law. And so limits on the pardon power have to become part of that vocabulary. No Kings is relatively recent, but it needs a series of agenda items, and that is certainly one of them. So that's my idea, yes, that the protest movement will push in that direction. We've seen it happen before, in the 19th century, before the Supreme Court struck down that civil rights law. We saw Congress, at the behest of the constituency led by Frederick Douglass, pass it, banning discrimination in hotels and restaurants. We saw legislation to protect voting rights. And then we saw it again, of course, in the 1960s, in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But as much as we've had these amazing examples where what I'm talking about happened, we also have a court that last week just essentially got rid of the most monumental achievement of the 20th century, which is the 1965 Voting Rights Act. They didn't formally say it was unconstitutional. They came really close. Just a tenth of an inch away from it. So we've got to not give up. We even did see in the aftermath of Nixon some attempts that we can look to continue to move forward. One of them is President Carter signed a law called the Ethics in Government Act that created an independent counsel. Now, this might surprise you, but what this office did was a person couldn't be fired by the president. They had the right to look into the president's crimes and crimes of close associates. And their policy was that sitting presidents could and should be indicted if they committed serious crimes. Now, what happened to them? There wasn't a proper understanding of how important that law was. And when Ken Starr, who was the last independent prosecutor, went after Clinton, Clinton went from being a huge proponent of that law to ensuring that it disappeared forever. And, I was at the Democratic convention that, I voted, I think it was my first election that I voted in. I voted for Clinton. But when we really look at what happened there, it was a disaster. If we would have had that law in place, we might have been able to stop this. And so that's one of the other pieces of legislation that on this podcast, The Oath in the Office, I'm talking about how it would work, how to pass it. And I'm having people like Stacey Abrams and Ted Lieu, and we're talking, how do you do this? And in fact, Sheldon Whitehouse, if you listen to the episode from about 4 weeks ago, said he's going to introduce it. So, it's possible.
Thank you for being here. And thank you to a friend of ours from Tapestry, Scott Westerfield, for the idea of bringing you here. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
I'm just having heard Ruth Ben-Yat, who spoke yesterday, whose book Strongmen has just enraptured me. But in light of having heard from her yesterday and then hearing you today, what comes to me is a couple things we discussed in our Q&A, which is how do we unseat and then unseat a corrupt administration and then reseat something that's not. Yeah. And the cohesiveness of message was a vulnerability that she mentioned, in terms of what we really don't have solidarity around right now. Yeah. And so just to shorten the question, do you have thoughts on that? And thank you for mentioning a couple people we probably want to be listening to right now. And thank you for your podcast and continuing to do this great work. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much. I think that's it. If you look at these past movements, and it's why, I went through pains to really describe not just how they opposed authoritarian presidents, but what they stood for and what the recovery looked like. And I talk in the book about recovery presidents. That's what a lot of the book is about, who enact the agenda of these protest movements. And that's how we have to start to think about groups like No Kings, that it isn't just an anti-Trump movement. I think so far in its infancy, that's how it's been framed. But it has to have a clear agenda of recovery of a democracy. That's the idea, that we have in many ways lost our democracy. And so how do we recover it? And so that's why I've tried to, it might sound policy wonky, these specific proposals about pardons, about being able to indict a sitting president, and I can talk more about how that legislation would work, pardon reform, independent counsel, all of these things. War powers is a lot of what I was talking to Ted Lieu about, and reclaiming, it's Congress that's supposed to declare war. The president is commander-in-chief, and you definitely wouldn't know that from anything in recent events. But all of those ideas need to be reclaimed through, it's not going to just, this Congress isn't just going to, even if Democrats take the House and take this, they won't just do it. It has to come at the behest of the movement that puts them there. So that's why I've been trying to get so specific. And, I've been working with the ACLU and other groups, they're a sponsor of the podcast, to try to say, there is a way to recover democracy. And it's not just about getting rid of Trump.
Hi, thank you so much. It was a great lecture. You had some really great historical examples, but today is a very different time. And I'm just wondering how you think bad actors in social media and AI affect our ability to resist authoritarianism, and if it makes it more difficult or easy.
I would say about each of these examples, and it's just true of history, you've heard the line, right? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And that's true of all these examples, that they're variations on a theme. And so what we have to do in our own time is recognize, exactly as you say, that we're facing a unique set of facts. And that was true too. In the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson and Johnson and Buchanan and Adams, these were very different time periods, yet the strategy that worked had a similarity to it. Now, one thing that gives me hope specifically about some of the challenges that we're facing in our own time is you can find parallels. So one of the things that comes up a lot is that unlike in Watergate, when the entire country basically learned together, when Butterfield said, there are tapes, and that's what I'm going to go do on Monday, is go listen to a lot of them, and the country did that as a group. That was part of why, even though we didn't fully recover, we were able to get rid of Nixon. everyone watching it together, 3 channels. But now in our own time, that's not the case. Media is much more fragmented. The MSNBC, or MS Now, which I often do, is like 1 million people. It's nothing like the 12 million that you would have had watching just Cronkite, or the more like 40 million that were watching the Watergate hearings. But if you look at earlier eras before Watergate, each of the ones I've talked about had fragmented media. So one of the things I did for the book was look at Frederick Douglass's paper and the North Star, which was his 2 publications. Their numbers were in the thousands, not in the millions. If you look at the newspaper editors in that first story, also much, much smaller, even in terms of percentages, than what we were looking at in the 1970s. So that is, my own personal, everybody's doing what they can, but the reason why I started the podcast, which is now, even though it was just some professor, I do it, by the way, with a comedian, because people need to be able to laugh at the same time that they're hearing about this horror show. John Fugelsang, who also has written a great book, actually, called Separation of Church and Hate, and it's on Sirius XM. Amazing book. And a lot of you must know it, too, I would think. It's been on the Times bestseller list for weeks. So what we're trying to do is to do, what they did. And, in under a year, we're already doing that. We have thousands and thousands of listeners. It's not millions. And other people are doing it. So that patchwork can work. These movements weren't everybody. They weren't 50% of the country. Frederick Douglass's movement was in the thousands. And yet look at what it did. I mean, the most successful revival of democracy, not just in American history, but probably in world history. This was a formerly enslaved person, self-educated, who grew to actually teach us more about the Constitution than any Supreme Court justice ever, or any president. And so that's what I think the hope is, that you can use, yes, the fragmented media that we have to push back. Now the problem is, as was true then too, the authoritarian side also has its media. But if we don't try to create our own, albeit fragmented media, then that's essentially giving up. And it can work.
All right, well,
Thank you all.
that's some pretty good questions here. Thank you, Corey. Just a reminder, we're going to have a book signing afterwards. The books are what helps us fund this event and bring Corey here. And I encourage you, if you have any students or children or grandchildren in your family, or perhaps a challenged relative or friend, reality challenged, who you want to give this to as a present, it's more effective, I think, to give a book like this than it is to have an argument with someone. So please think about it. Now, Bill, where's Bill McNeely standing? Is he here? We have somebody we're going to have a table set up. We're going to have Post-it notes available so you can write what you'd like Corey to inscribe on your book. And it's only $12 for the paperback, and $18, and some of you have discount coupons, so please consider that. Also, we have some food available, a lot of food available still in the room, so please avail yourself of it. And thank you, all of you, very much for coming out today.
So where are we going? Thank you.